Great. So should I start?
There are still five more people coming in. They're joining.
Okay.
One more coming in. It's registering slowly. Okay, we should be good. We don't have anyone waiting. Oh, yep.
Okay. Right. Good evening from France and good morning or good afternoon to those joining us from elsewhere. And welcome to our World Literature Webinar Fall Series. As many of you know, the series began in 2022 as an independent scholarly initiative that brings together voices challenging what we mean by world literature. We approach world literature not as a fixed canon or a geography of texts, but as an ongoing practice of world making through language, a way of asking how literature reimagines the world it names. Each session considers how literary form intersects with translation, circulation, and power, and how writing can open new possibilities of belonging across borders. Tonight, we turn to poetry and the ecological imagination, to how literature can help us rethink the human relationship to the natural world in the wake of colonial violence. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Jane Hiddleston from the University of Oxford, where she is Professor of Literatures in French. She has written extensively on Francophone and postcolonial literatures, including Frantz Fanon Literature and Invention and Aimé Césaire, Inventor of Souls, and she served as co-investigator on the AHRC-funded project Creative Multilingualism. Her research asks how language, ethics, and imagination intersect in contexts of decolonization and global transformation. In her talk this evening, Literature and the Ecological World, Anticolonial Ecopoetics in the Caribbean, Professor Hiddleston offers an account of the relationship between anti-colonial thought and ecological form. Turning to Caribbean writers, particularly Suzanne and Aimé Césaire, she traces how poetry can articulate modes of agency that exceed the human. Through this lens, she examines how colonial histories of extraction have shaped our conception of nature and how Caribbean poetics can unsettle that inheritance. One idea that especially resonates with me is Suzanne Césaire's homme-plante, or plant human, a figure that fuses human and vegetal vitality and proposes a life rooted in endurance and renewal rather than mastery. Professor Hiddleston revisits the image not simply as metaphor, but as a provocation to the ethical limits of the human itself, asking how poetic form can think ecologically and politically at once. Her work opens a conversation between postcolonial critique and the environmental humanities, revealing the Caribbean as a site where new ways of being and imagining continue to emerge. And I quote from her abstract. In response to the disastrous effects of climate change, there has recently been an explosion of interest in more ecologically sustainable ways of thinking and in new conceptions of the relationship between humans and the ecological world. In this paper, I explore how French Caribbean writers have been rethinking our relationship with ecology since the 1940s as they creatively challenge the brutal complicity of colonial exploitation with environmental destruction. I take as a theoretical springboard the work of environmental thinkers such as Malcom Ferdinand, whose Decolonial Ecology, first published in French in 2019, argues that the history of enslavement and the destruction of the land by the plantation system make the Caribbean the scene of ecological thinking. Ferdinand's work complements Kathryn Yusoff's A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, in which she explores how the Anthropocene rests on racist capitalist exploitation and briefly notes the subversive potential of Caribbean writers such as Aimé Césaire. These thinkers do not read these key writers in any detail, however, so my paper complements their broader theories with an examination of the ways in which poetry can use experimental imagery to help us rethink our relationship with the world. The discussion opens with an exploration of Suzanne Césaire's conception of the homme-plante, which offers an alternative vision of the interpenetration between humans and the ecosystem, before moving on to examine Aimé Césaire's evocations of human, ecological, and cosmic forces turning against the oppressor. Aimé Césaire's rebellious Ecopoetics raises questions, however, about the place of human and poetic agency in the ecological world, as the poetic voice at times confidently summons environmental forces and at others dissolves the human subject to imagine a plural, distributed form of agency. We are truly delighted to welcome Professor Hiddleston this evening. Please join me in greeting her. Professor Hiddleston, the stage is yours.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to do this, similar, and thank you, Seda, for kind of setting it all up and making it all work. So as Simla has said, I'm going to be speaking mostly about anti-colonial eco-poetical work in the Caribbean, but I did, some years ago, I was involved in a bigger project on world literature, which is presumably kind of how you found me. And I was working particularly on kind of multilingualism and cultural diversity within world literature. I've actually sort of moved on since then, but I've tried to tie this paper back a little bit to that, to make a connection then between ideas about cultural diversity to ideas about ecological diversity. So I hope that's going to speak to you in some way. And then I hope it's also okay if I kind of then take things into a bit of a different direction. So what I'm going to do is I'll share the screen so you can see my slides. So hopefully that works. Sorry. Okay. Is that working? Can you see the slides okay?
Yes,
We're good.
Yep, good. Okay, so I can just make a start. Okay, so I've put a bit of greenery on the front slide there just for you to kind of contemplate. It'll become more specifically relevant later, but so literature and the ecological world, anti-colonial ecopoetics in the Caribbean. So in response to the recent flourishing in studies of world literature, a number of critics have identified a lack of attention in the field to questions of environment and ecology. So world literary studies may demand a kind of increased reflection on literary diversity across the globe, but this focus on cultural plurality hasn't necessarily brought with it a proper attention to ecological diversity and to the threat to diverse non-human species posed by the global capitalist system. Critics such as Amir Mufti, Feng Shea, who may be familiar to world literary scholars, have argued that the generalizing sweep of world literature and its complicity with global capitalism necessitates definitely a better understanding of our interconnected but infinitely variegated cultural world. But if this world economy is supposed to also at the same time be a world ecology, then to be complete, I think this critique must also seek to preserve ecological diversity and to contest the damage done by globalization on social, cultural, economic, but also ecological levels. So with this in mind, a number of critics have proposed what they've called the planetary turn to name the emergence of a mode of thinking that captures our global connectedness, but is also capable then of accommodating social and ecological diversity at the same time. So for critics such as Amy Elias and Christian Moraru, attention to the planetary rather than to the global. First of all, it's about relationality rather than uniformity. But also importantly for these critics, they're demanding attention not only to human diversity, but also to ecological diversity. Oh, hang on, I was just gonna, there we go. Yeah, so just to make sure that works. So I was, quoting then Florian Musknug. He notes then that planetary thinking does not conceive human action as distinct from non-human action, but views it as a major geological force that intersects with other environmental phenomena and a single volatile temporal force field. So the relationality championed by these critics of world literature should be understood then as that between the human and the non-human. And the connectivity that's celebrated by world literary studies must emphasize not only cultural difference and interactions, but also our deep embeddedness and reliance on the environment. So basically, we need to emphasize the dynamic entanglement between manifold peoples and cultures, but also the connections between the human and the physical world. And while this planetary turn has emerged and gathered force over the last 10 years as the ravages of environmental destruction have become ever more evident, it's revealing that some post-colonial literatures have actually been signalling an awareness of this dual imperative for some time. Colonialism in many cases involved not just the appropriation of political and economic power, but the seizing, restructuring, and often brutal management of the land. Moreover, colonial conceptions of landscape were highly contradictory, on the one hand promulgating exoticist visions of a colonized landscape, and then on the other fueling a politics that relied on the sapping of its resources. So the landscape was construed as by kind of paradoxical colonial fantasy so that it fulfilled then the roles of a kind of exotic pleasure garden on the one hand, but also the bearer of economic profit. So I'm not going to particularly pursue the use of the term planetary here. That was just as a kind of bridge, I guess, between world literature and this ecological thinking. But I did want to draw attention to this call for attention to ecological diversity alongside cultural diversity within studies of world literature, and then to analyze its significance as well as the tensions of decolonial ecological thinking in the Caribbean. So the complicity between colonialism and environmental destruction is perhaps nowhere seen more extensively than in the Caribbean. So it's here that the plantation system rested on this flagrant disregard, both for the rights of enslaved people and for the ecological environment. Michael Niblett, for example, together with Chris Campbell, has analysed the connections between what he calls the world economy and the world ecology, and has for this reason focused specifically on and most extensively on the Caribbean. And this serves then as a prime example of a setting where capitalism relied on the exploitation of landscape and brought with it devastating ecological damage. Malcom Ferdinand also has explored how the Caribbean is the site of, he calls it a double fracture, arguing then that this environmental fracture most intensively accompanied modernity's colonial fracture. And then concomitantly, Caribbean writers such as Aimé and Suzanne Césaire, who I'm going to be focusing on today, so just give you a bit of an image to kind of introduce them. These writers infuse their anti-colonial writing with evocations of the agency of local landscape as well as of elemental forces. And then they testify both to a commitment to the preservation of ecological diversity and also to an awareness of the hubris of the attempt to master and domesticate the natural environment so comprehensively. In Aimé Césaire's poetry, for example, the lyric subject is frequently connected or blurred with vegetal, animal, geological, and elemental forces. So both humans and non-humans suffer from colonial exploitation, and both conspire in the articulation then of anti-colonial revolt. In Suzanne Césaire's essays, moreover, the devastation of the landscape by the plantation system is glossed over by what she calls the great camouflage of the image of a tropical paradise. And resistance to this manipulation can be expressed then through a better understanding of the mutual dependence and the blurring of plant and human, as so Simla mentioned earlier, this idea of the plant-human, which I'm going to come back to. So I want to explore a little bit the ways in which Aimé and Suzanne Césaire imagine this blurring then between the human and the ecological world. And I'm going to take Suzanne Césaire's essays as a starting point, before then reading some of the intricacies in Aimé Césaire's thought and poetry, as he seeks to reinvent both poetic environment and environmental agency, and to theorize the ways in which literature or the poetic subject as well might listen to or intervene in the ecological world. So just as a kind of quick sort of to pinpoint, I guess, some of the kind of tensions or the main questions that I'm really looking at, there's a bit of ambiguity around agency then in the work of somebody like Aimé Césaire. So with Suzanne Césaire, there's more of a sense that human agency is just kind of given over to the landscape, whereas in Aimé Césaire, there are moments when the poet is trying to express a more kind of concerted human form of resistance, and other moments where the poetic self is dissolved into the landscape and into this vegetal imagery. So I'm going to go through that in a bit more detail and try to kind of unpick those moments in the poetry where we kind of see something of this contradiction, and then think a little bit about why that's there and what that tells us. So agency is the kind of problem then in this mode of thinking. What do we do about agency? Okay, so it's Suzanne Césaire's essays then that constitute, I think, the unacknowledged theoretical foundation of Caribbean ecopoetics. Suzanne Césaire's thought creatively theorizes the interweaving and mutual dependency of human and plant life, and in ways that anticipate then both some of the most experimental imagery in Aimé Césaire's poetry, and also then the kind of the broader cosmopolitical relationality, for example, affirmed by people such as Malcom Ferdinand. I don't know how much people know about Suzanne Césaire. I could give you a lot of detail, but I'm going to try and keep it quick. So she was Aimé Césaire's wife. She produced 7 essays that were published in the journal Tropique between 1941 and 1945. Tropique was a local journal founded by Aimé and Suzanne Césaire and colleagues in Martinique. And it was really kind of almost like a student newspaper. It was just read quite locally until Jean-Michel Place republished the volumes in 1978. So she published these 7 incredibly kind of creative, vibrant essays. And then they had 6 children, and she was a school teacher, and she didn't write anymore. There's a play that has never been found. She wrote a play, but she was kind of eclipsed really by her husband. But she wrote these incredible essays. So that's where I'm getting my material, and I do kind of get the sense that some of the sort of theoretical sophistication behind Aimé Césaire's ecological thinking comes, in fact, from Suzanne. So she published these essays then between 1941 and 1945. She draws initially on Leo Frobenius's conception of Ethiopian civilization, but actually quite quickly she moves beyond the German ethnographer. There are issues with using, obviously, a European ethnographer as opposed to African thinkers anyway. But so she quickly, in fact, moves beyond him and sketches this quite provocative and creative idea of the homme-plante, or the plant human, which is associated then with an idea of ecological agency, or kind of interconnected ecological agency. And whilst for Frobenius, this sort of idea of the passive, he talks about the passive integration of the Ethiopian into the ecological environment, and he contrasts this very schematically with what he calls the Hamitic drive for conquest. Suzanne Césaire kind of takes that comparison and then actually shifts it over to Martinique, and uses it to imagine this figure of the resilient and spontaneous growth of the plant human then. And I've got a quotation there. So she says, so it's about this connectedness, but also about this idea of resilience. So she says, always and everywhere in the slightest manifestations, the primacy of the plant trampled underfoot, but still alive, dead but reviving, the plant free, silent and proud. And there's lots I could say here about the idea of the kind of the undergrowth and it's underfoot and it's kind of hidden. Whereas in Aimé Césaire, we get lots of very vertical trees kind of standing up. There's lots of imagery of uprising, debout in Aimé Césaire, although then later that becomes more horizontal again, and I'll come to that right at the very end. But I think there is something significant here about this idea of kind of it's underfoot, it's kind of trampled, and yet it survives. So she's saying that with this figure then of the homme-plante, the humans live both with and like plants. So they might be kind of trampled, but they have this ability to grow sideways and inventively to resist their oppression. And the stultification caused by the imposition of colonial culture then can best be overturned if Martinicans rediscover their anchoring in the earth and unleash the creative and inventive energy that's latent in this connection and its ongoing evolution. Suzanne Césaire's Anticolonial Ecopoetics reaches, I think, its fullest expression in her last essay, which was called the Great Camouflage. This was the last essay that was printed as the very last essay in the last volume of Tropique, also in 1945. And it's here that her critique of this false kind of picture postcard image of the Caribbean finishes with this extraordinary incendiary sequence, really, that brings together ecology, geology, the cosmos, and this kind of outburst of creative energy. So as the essay unfolds, we get imagery of vegetal growth tied to then a resistance both to colonial management and to tourist stereotypes. And this kind of bursts through then the veneer of what she calls the Great Camouflage, and increasingly sort of animates her evocations of human and non-human life. So, for example, in the last few pages, we get the image of a peasant who's surveying the land. His feet are immersed in the soil, and then he feels rising through him this, she says, it's a slow vegetal upthrust, this idea of a kind of uprising that comes from the earth and through the human figure. Then we get this character, there's the figure of a dancer, a dancing woman, she names Bergilde, and she talks about how she moves her hips with the kind of the heaving of the depths of the volcanoes. At the same time, this movement reinvigorates the African past that lives on within her. So the landscape kind of infiltrates and shapes the lives of both figures, who exist then within its rhythms, with the relationality then of this plant human. And this mode of existence fundamentally opposes the drive for mastery and domestication of the land that was manifested most obscenely by the plantation system in the Caribbean. The essay then ends with imagery that ignites the agency of the landscape, bewildering the European poets who tried to name it. So she's referencing here people like André Breton and André Masson, who, you know, they had quite a kind of exoticist sort of fascination, both for, in fact, Suzanne Césaire herself, who was thought to be very beautiful. And, you know, there's a whole thing with her kind of image, but also the image of the landscape as being this kind of, again, almost like this tropical paradise, but she makes it here into something much more kind of powerful rather than something that's kind of pleasing to the eye. It's much more kind of overwhelming. So the imagery she has is it's all incredibly powerful. We've got this metaphor, for example, of a vegetal fire, which kind of connects then the plant with the volcano, almost as if geological eruption also infuses ecological life with its dynamic energy. So vegetation and rock formations are bound together in an image again of interconnected life that defies and belittles human agency. And then there's the figure of a liana vine. So I wrote a whole article about liana vine because I just found them all over the place in Suzanne and Aimé Césaire. And it's a figure it's a plant that kind of grows by growing sort of off and around other plants and trees. And they take it as a figure then for connectivity, but also because it kind of links the earth and the cosmos. So it kind of goes from the soil to the sky, but by always connecting with other plants and trees. And so she says on this, so this is the kind of closing kind of epiphany almost of the great camouflage. She says, here the tropical vines rocking vertiginously take on ethereal poses to charm the precipices. With their trembling fingertips, they latch onto the ungraspable cosmic flurry, rising all throughout the drum-filled nights. And there, in my image, I tried to find some good liana vines, so I found that one. But so basically, it's a figure then of connection. And Suzanne Césaire's extraordinary kind of eco-poetical writing then at the end of The Great Camouflage, I think the imagery and the way she writes it with these long sentences connecting different elements in the environment very much itself weaves together elements in the environment then to conjure this powerfully energized and vibrant interconnected system. So human agency in Suzanne Césaire's essays is basically, for the most part, subordinated to the agency of the landscape. Indeed, she does at times emphasize passivity, but in ways that I think should be taken to be, or could be taken to be, sorry, for it could, but shouldn't be taken to be problematic for the formation of an eventual resistance movement. This is maybe where the tension comes in around agency in Aimé Césaire's writing. For Suzanne Césaire, though, I think passivity is more about a mode of acceptance of the rhythms of organic life. And this in turn then defies the hubris that drove both the human and the environmental destruction that was brought about by colonialism. But in contrast to Suzanne Césaire's essays, the human agency in Aimé Césaire's poetry is much more complex. So sometimes it's kind of figured as distributed and scattered across the environment. Sometimes human agency becomes much more preeminent. And the figure of the poet then is sometimes blurred with or is even subsumed by the agency of the environment. But then other times he's quite assertive in sort of commanding or summoning the landscape to join his revolt. And I think this changing portrayal of ecological and human agency perhaps shows us something of the difficulty of combining anti-colonial resistance then with ecological thinking, indicating perhaps both the importance of this project and its complexity in addressing both human and environmental exploitation. So my point really is not to kind of be critical of Césaire when human agency kind of seems to take more of a center stage, but to use him to see how he's kind of posing questions and struggling to kind of reconcile different sort of elements in his political agenda. The relationship between the poet, environment, and the cosmos is theorized, I think, most explicitly in the essay Poetry and Knowledge, which was published in January 1945, also in Anthropocenes, so alongside Suzanne Césaire's Great Camouflage. Césaire starts by stating categorically his rejection of Western science, which it's here not kind of overtly linked to colonialism, but which nevertheless clearly underpins colonialism in its ultimately destructive quest to delineate and to classify. So he says, scientific knowledge counts, measures, classifies, and kills. Contrary to this drive, Césaire then celebrates the art of the poet, who rather keeps himself open to the rhythms of life, who roots himself in the earth and connects with the vegetation. So he says, for example, like the tree, like the animal, he has abandoned himself to primal life, has said yes, and has consented to this immense life that exceeded him. He has rooted himself in the earth, has stretched out his arms, has played with the sunlight. He has become a tree, he has blossomed, and he has sung. So poetry itself here is a kind of, he says, an épanouissement in French, or a sort of a flourishing, a dizzying expansion of the self. There's imagery there, also of kind of vertiginous movement. It's associated also with the embrace of the cosmos in all its enormity, and abandoning any claim for sovereignty or for knowledge, certainly in the sense of scientific knowledge. And poetic language, he says, is language in its pure form, which means that it's liberated to open up to the connections of the universe, using metaphor in particular, and to discover new links and precipitate transformation. And metaphor is going to be quite important for other writers. Anthropocenes, René Ménil, for example, kind of takes metaphor almost as the starting point for a kind of anticolonial ecopoetics, because it's with metaphor you can see connections in things. One thing becomes another, and that's what is happening kind of in the environment all the time. But if the poet is uniquely capable, then he seems to be suggesting of this opening out onto the world. Césaire still does occasionally accord him this privileged status and a kind of active role of a sort that I think wasn't really discernible in Suzanne Césaire's writing. So while he's receptive to the environment and allows himself to be integrated into the cosmos, he remains also at times quite an active subject, and also even claims a position of authority. He repeats then, the poet speaks, as if to kind of give his words a kind of spiritual power. This opening out does not bring about, he says, the disarming of the poet, who retains a sense of rebellious anger, implying then that the poet's affect still fuels his words. The poet also creates metaphors, engendering transformation rather than just witnessing it in the ecosystem. So it's about a kind of seizing of sort of creative agency as well. And the poet's experience still seems quite central. So there is a way in which in Césaire, or certainly in the kind of earlier Césaire, the je is still at the center of this process, even if that je is always communicating with the environment. So he says, for example, still in Poetry and Knowledge, he says, so my past is there, showing me and hiding its face. My future is there, and it holds its hand out to me. Rockets are set off. It's my childhood that's burning. My childhood speaks to me and looks for me. And within who I am, who I will be stands on tiptoe. So it is about opening out the self, but just the je has quite a kind of a prominent role, which, as I say, is going to change late in his later work. And it's something that I've also then been tracing in the work of Edouard Glissant, who might be known to you as quite kind of relevant to studies of world literature. Also kind of at times maintains a je, and at times kind of dissolves the je and uses a vous or an elle, or no kind of human figure at all. So I'm interested in the kind of sort of changeable nature of this je and how it kind of flickers in and out and has different connotations. So here, I think in this early essay, it seems as if while the poet opens his arms to the ecosystem, the language at the same time retains an idea of a lyric self. And this use of the first person, I think, contrasts very much with Suzanne Césaire's writing, where actually their human subjectivity was very much kind of blended then with the movement and life of the land. Throughout his poetry then, Aimé Césaire conjures imagery of fusion with the ecosystem, as human and non-human struggle together against forces of oppression. But the poetic subject then adopts a variety of different positions as this interconnected system morphs and expresses itself in different ways through the poems. Throughout, Césaire seeks to imagine a subject immersed in the landscape and the elements. Both suffer from a history of brutalization, and revolt is expressed through turmoil then in the body, but also in the voice and then in the ecosystem. And often the body is kind of figured through imagery that might come from the ecosystem, from plants. So there's, trees have flesh and then human bodies have leaves, for example. I mean, that's crude, but there's that kind of mixing of imagery. I'm going to take a few just briefly examples from different stages of his career. So I'm going to start with the volume The Miraculous Weapons, which was published in 1946. And here I look at how the imagery repeatedly shifts between a kind of a pluralized, diffuse poetic subject submitting to the forces of the landscape and the cosmos, and then at other times a more affirmative je or I, claiming the role of a leader. In Lost Body, which was another volume that was published a little bit later in 1950, it's illustrated by images by Picasso. There are moments where the poetic I really does become a kind of demiurgic figure. He celebrates fusion with the landscape, but also claims a kind of incredibly powerful subjective poetic force. By the time of the last volume of poetry that he published, which was I Laminaria, published in 1982, however, assertions of resistance and revolt become much more muted. So actually, this is the older Césaire. He's much more disillusioned. The poet expresses instead his humility. Humanity is often belittled in this vast cosmic scope of what he calls great time, le grand temps. So the human presence in I Laminaria is 40 years later, I think a bit closer to Suzanne Césaire's passive integrated participant in the greater movement and growth of the ecosystem. So I'm going to start with one example from The Miraculous Weapons then. It's a poem called The Great Noon, Le Grand Midi. And it perhaps, I think, displays the most powerful vision of environmental agency, but also betrays, I think, most intensely the struggle of the poetic subject to find a voice of resistance after a history of violence and self-loss. So we get these kind of two things happening at the same time, this search for a kind of active, assertive voice of resistance, and then this dissolution of the self and the environment. The poem opens then with this kind of frenzy of activity. So we get imagery of insurrection arises. I've put a slash there because that's where the line, right, it moves over the line. Often he has things moving over the line, but also there'll be spaces even. So he does lots of things typographically with the words there. So this insurrection arises. It's led by the queen of the molten wind. I always feel like this stuff sounds really weird in English. I swear it kind of sounds a bit more natural in French. But anyway, I'm using the translation today. We get tentative signs of human movement, which are part of a gathering, a kind of harsh swarm, he says, made up of, so got this sense of real energy of spurts, crossings, burnings, and strippings. The poet here is then figured as alone and naked. He witnesses all this uproar. He's bewildered by these biological phenomena that are conjured then by a series of obscure terms that actually deliberately, I think, perplex the reader. The poetic voice also reaches out, but kind of struggles to capture the landscape that it's buffeted about by. So he says, for example, so at the bottom of the slide, I toss about, throat stretched amidst mysterious rettings and rolled up atolls. So the frenzy that surrounds him mixes seemingly human experiences such as patience and expectation then with these kind of more organic kind of cosmic gyrations, metamorphoses taking place in the landscape. And he seems both to want to try to sort of rise above that chaos, to find some perspective on it, but also to find himself engulfed by this elemental fury. At the end of the poem, he resolves to leave. He's sort of overwhelmed by this tumult in the landscape around him. And here too, there's a tension between the poet's fusion with the landscape and these more confident assertions of action. So he seems to want to distinguish himself from the apathetic landscape. It's this rich land gorged in sluggish water. And he insists then repeatedly, he says, I'm leaving. The poet's self-affirmation appears to separate him from the lethargy in the cosmos, though at time it also seems to he seems to kind of summon it to allow it to follow his example. So the stars are rotting in the sidereal swamps, but I advance more sure and more secret and more terrible than the rotting star. So you can see he's kind of like also stepping away. He's disillusioned with a sense of stagnation and wants to kind of come up with a sort of more assertive position or program for resistance. Nevertheless, in this departure, he returns again to the forest, and the final lines suggest a surge of light in both the poet and the cosmos. The poetic subject has a clear, lyrical first-person voice, but the agency he presents also moves and is moved by the ecosystem an expression then of this more distributed agency, but that also at the same time, or intermittently incorporates a speaking I. The closing image is a surrealist vision of rising energy in the poet and the sun. It says, already the little bumps on my forehead and the rose of my pulse are catapulting the great noons, the last quotation there on the slide. So the poet's energy catalyzes the daylight here, as if human and non-human move in tandem, with the poet nevertheless clinging on to this position of leadership. As his poetic vision evolves, Césaire continues to experiment with the representation of human and non-human agency, including yet more defiantly surrealist visions in a volume published in 1948, Solar Throat Slashed, translated, and then followed by a slightly more pared down and direct rebellious insistent in Lost Body. And I'm just going to pause a little bit on that volume in this context of Césaire's Anticolonial Ecopoetics, because of its explicit reflections on the relationship between the poet and the landscape, and also because of the illustrations by Picasso also foreground these kind of fused plant-animal forms. So I've just got a couple of the images of Picasso that you can kind of contemplate there. So the volume consists of 10 new poems by Césaire that were kind of commissioned together. He was working with Picasso on this volume and created them for the volume to work on with Picasso. And these images by Picasso then experiment with these anthropomorphic forms that sort of blend, again, human and plant imagery in ways that beautifully complement then Césaire's own landscape imagery in the poems. So the artworks weave intriguingly through the volume. Sorry, there's a bit of movement. Through the volume, not so much serving, I think, as they're not meant to be precise illustrations of the poems, but they're showcasing these preoccupations with the suffering and self-affirmation of the body, tinged also with erotic references that are shaped by the connection between plants and humans. Césaire had actually also been collaborating with the Cuban painter Wilfredo Lam during the 1940s, and they met in 1941. Lam had illustrated the Cuban edition of Césaire's famous Notebook of Return to My Native Land in 1943. And several poems were then dedicated to Lam during this period. And then there's a whole series on him in Césaire's last volume, I Laminaria, in 1982. And both poet and artist again share this commitment to exploring human forms as part of a wider ecological world. So Césaire really kind of praised Lam's similar energized reinvigoration of Caribbean art in an article first printed in Cahiers d'Art, and the terms here that really are quite reminiscent of Suzanne Césaire's rejection of the hermetic mode and this embrace of the plant-human. So there's a little quotation here. I'm kind of aware that time is going by, so maybe I won't read out the quotation. You can just have a look. It's the last part, really, where he's kind of celebrating the forest, the swamp, etc., the liana tree again. So I put in this description of Lam's work just to show how it captures, I think, also Césaire's own aesthetic as it developed through the 1940s, and where this anti-colonial contestation was combined then with this affirmation of the dynamic, interconnected life of human landscape and cosmos. I now just want to pause quickly on one of the poems in Lost Body. In fact, the poem called Lost Body that's central to the volume of that name. I'm choosing this one because in some ways it's one of Césaire's most confident expressions of the poet's fusion with the environment, but also his most confident kind of aspiration to rebellious poetic power. And the opening lines, I think, figure the speaking subject as fused with the elements in this embrace of this affirmative embrace of their energy. So he says, I who Krakatoa, I who everything better than monsoon, I who open chest, I who lilaps, I who pleat, better than cloaca, I who outside the musical scale. There's loads of things going on here. So it's interesting that the nouns themselves actually function as verbs, as if the poem kind of acts as the volcano. The monsoon, the lilaps is this speedy dog whose name means storm wind. And then the repetition of the I at the start of each line, I think, reinforces at the same time the power of the first person, even as he is speaking with these animals and elements. So the poet claims a kind of agency that's blended with the ecosystem, while at the same time foregrounding his subjective power in gathering this agency together. Following this initial assertiveness, though, he does then also seek humility. Later passages show him more subordinated to the landscape. He says, to the point of losing myself into the living semolina of a well-opened earth. So descending into the earth, he discovers also this essential kind of connectedness. He, in capital letters there, he talks about the splendid total encounter, which suggests, I think, an originary relationality, a mutual dependence within the ecosystem that would defy the claims of mastery and classification that he denounced then in that essay, Poetry and Knowledge. The poet imagines then life flooding into him, figuring here the self at this moment as more passive. He's receiving energy and stimulating from the environment rather than claiming control. The second half of the poem more explicitly conjures the history of enslavement, though, and portrays both the poetic self and the landscape as beaten down by oppression and suffering. So the speaking subject, checking where I am, yeah, the speaking subject, he adopts this prostrate position of an enslaved man, and he insists, j'en fale, it's a polysemic reference here, conjuring both the Greek term for the navel of the universe, as if the poet is kind of reaching down into the very depths of the earth. But then the term also recalls the Lydian queen who enslaved Hercules, and it connotes then an inversion of the relationship between master and slave. And as the poem moves towards its conclusion, the poet's revolt shatters earth and sky. It demands this reconfiguration then of the cosmos to reject the old order of suffering. So he says, I shall raise so violent a cry that I shall splatter the entire sky. So here we get a blurring of the image of human and non-human, calling at the same time for the transformation of the land, as well as the rebellion of the people. And it's a vision of a kind of complete renewal then that the poet himself also engenders. The line is, I think, an extraordinary assertion of poetic power, at once referencing his claim, perhaps for the proper recognition of Martinique, and as a département, and also demanding a whole new geography. And he finishes then with this extraordinary statement, I shall command the islands to exist. So that does seem to be as the poet and politician Césaire are claiming an extraordinary kind of a degree of power here, but also kind of blurring with the islands and kind of bringing them into existence. So they're very much now kind of claiming their freedom, but we do get a very clear sense of the demiurgic stance of the jeu, as if it's the poet who's going to bring this new liberated order into being. This very bold avant-garde aesthetic in Lost Body gets tempered, as I suggested, in some of the later volumes. And I think the poetic voice never again expresses that confidence that we saw in that final line of Lost Body. His surrealist visions of the 1940s convey a sense of the power of the poet and the ecosystem kind of working together. The poet dramatizes with extraordinary energy and creativity his belief in the privileged communication with the cosmos. But then he became quite preoccupied with the political difficulties in Martinique. He switched to a slightly more kind of politically engaged form of poetry in 1960 with Ferments. And then he comes to this much more humble tone with I Laminaria in 1982. So here the volume has lost a lot of the rebellious power of the 1940s, and I think articulates maybe Césaire's most challenging ecopoetics in its portrayal of the forces of the landscape, this time either with the poet in a more passive state or in the absence of human agency. The title, I Laminaria, already figures the poet then as a form of seaweed. I Laminaria is seaweed. So I was talking earlier about the kind of vertical, upright image of the tree we get in earlier volumes. Here it's the horizontal flat form of the seaweed, and the idea of the self kind of stretched out on the rocks. Laminaria, the term also echoes the term in the French, it's lagunaire, the laguna, in the opening poem which I'm about to cite, the lagunal calendar. Can just get that up. It evokes a much slower rhythmic temporality of the lagoon kind of protected from the open sea, but also gesturing towards the idea of lacunaire or lacunary or something missing. He uses lowercase letters throughout, so the I is always lowercase, the start of each line is always lowercase, as if to kind of get rid of any sense of sort of mastery and completion that might come from the use of capitals. And then there's a short prefatory reflection to the volume, which situates then the poems in what he calls non-time, related then to a sort of much larger cosmic temporality. He also calls it great time, le grand temps. And these poems then are going to constantly shift then, as I put in the quotation, they shift between sun and shadow, mountain and mangrove, between dawn and dusk, stumbling and binary, embracing the changing landscape and following its rhythms, rather than, again, attempting any sort of assertion of control. I'm a bit aware of the time here, and similarly, you've put your camera on. How much shall I start to wrap up? How much time have we got?
As long as you need.
Oh, fine. Okay, I'll just keep going, but it will only be a few more minutes. Okay, thanks. So I'll just say a couple of things about this opening poem. It's called Lagunal Calendar, Calendrier Lagunaire, which immediately, I think, announces a clear contrast to the powerful stance that we saw at the beginning of Lost Body, where the poet was claiming then to command the land, but also, so there he was claiming to command the land. Here now it's much more just about inhabiting it with its long history of oppression and destruction. So the poetic voice recognizes the overwhelming and wayward force of geological movement, submitting now to its flow and accepting its potential destructiveness. I inhabit not a flow of basalt, but the tidal wave of lava that runs back up the gulch at full speed. The poet's consciousness, too, is part of what he says, a kind of vast thought, as he recognizes the pettiness of his usual preoccupations and opens himself out to associate himself with geological movement, with elemental forces and animal behaviors. As the critic Carrie Noland argues, this inhabiting is at once suggestive of the poet's kind of unsettled search for rootedness and belonging, but also a looser sense of his haunting or animating the landscape. So he dwells in it in a state of sort of passive and uncertain fusion with its movements, rather than just conceiving it as a kind of background for his own purposes. By the end of the poem, the poetic voice articulates more clearly a sense of disillusionment about his status and agency. It says, rack, rubbish, hooking myself like devil's guts, or the uncoiling like a piranha. So the elements wield their power while the poet clings onto the rocks or uncoils himself like the piranha, which is another form of liana vine, as if to embrace then his connection with and dependence on the land. This self-effacement is a cause for the suffering of the poet, but it nevertheless, he says, it kind of fills his words with heightened meaning. He says it renders sumptuous certain of my words. So I think what he's doing is kind of trying to show here that his language is infused with the energies of this dynamic, interconnected ecosystem, while the human subject surrenders all temptation to sort of impose meaning or control. So just to conclude then, Césaire was in no way an environmental activist. In fact, there's a bit of an issue there about how the poetry is so full of this environmental imagery, but his politics, he showed no interest in environmentalist politics. In fact, he was very much in favor of kind of the urban development and industrialization in Martinique. But I do think his poetry sketches a salutary anti-colonial ecopoetics, while at the same time maybe displaying some of the difficulties we might experience in seeking a more ethical understanding of our relationship with the ecosystem. So thinkers such as Malcom Ferdinand, who I referenced at the beginning, are evidently inspired by Césaire's visionary fusion of Black subjectivity with the earth, and his use of, and so people like Ferdinand use his imagery to conjure then what he calls the cosmopolitics of relation. Though he also quotes some of the more demiurgic statements without actually kind of reflecting on this kind of problematic human agency that we get through Césaire. Towards the end of Kathryn Yusoff's A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, also she cites Césaire's conjuring in the Notebook of Return to My Native Land. She talks about the conjuring of the ghosts of geology, for example, where he says, then I would rediscover the secret of great communications and of great combustions. And then his assertion that he says, I would have words vast enough to contain you, you land tense and drunken. But there's a lot of stuff going on here that critics like Ferdinand and Yusoff don't really comment on. So there's clearly a kind of great vision, again, of poetic power in these lines. And they don't really kind of think about how these assertions may be kind of what lead the poet to perhaps claim the grandiose role of a spokesman a few lines later. The poetic subject in the Notebook, in fact, does express his disillusionment towards this role. There's a later scene in the tram where he's contemplating this very kind of downtrodden figure of a Black man, and kind of is horrified by his complicity with the women who laugh at this man. But I think there's also a kind of bigger tension between Césaire's aesthetic sort of assertion of defiant poetic power, and also then this dissolution and humility in the poetic voice as it dissolves itself into the ecosystem. And I think all of this maybe just reveals something about the difficulty of combining a stance of anti-colonial resistance with an embrace of environmental ethics. as the poet feels the need then to both kind of lead the uprising and also to express his humility. Through his career then, Césaire shifts his emphasis towards a fuller abandonment of poetic agency in that last volume, I Laminaria, as he reaches perhaps a more complete understanding of the folly of human hubris and surrenders his ambition to command the landscape in revolt. But the tension in his writing, I think, nevertheless perhaps crystallizes the conflicting demands in his work, as he at once speaks out then for the rights of his people and testifies to the agency of the land and the cosmos, as these then actually belittle or ultimately absorb all human will to power. So I'll stop there. And shall I stop sharing the screen so we can kind of see each other a bit more easily?
Yes, okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you very, very much for this beautiful presentation of the agency of postcolonial poetry by way of your pertinent examples from Césaire's. I think we will now move on to the question and answer session. And I invite all those participants here to share their questions or observations, either by unmuting themselves and also clicking on the relevant icon here, or using the chat. But before letting others pose their questions, I'd like to indulge myself in posing mine, because as I've been actually for a very long time, I've been doing my research on the agency of what you call non-Western literatures in terms of worlding in Peng Chea's sense, doing something concretely. I was actually wondering, because as I keep thinking about the potential of post-colonial poetry for worlding, in your view, how does poetry, and in particular post-colonial, perhaps you could also think in this term, in these terms in the terms of Césaire's poetry, how could they actually enact worlding differently from the novel, especially when it forms foreground relation, voice, and on locality? That's something that I kept thinking as I was listening to your wonderful talk.
Okay, thank you so much. That's a really interesting question. And I don't want to kind of be tempted to somehow sort of denigrate the novel and say it's not capable of doing these kinds of things. There's actually lots of really interesting examples of kind of anti-colonial eco-poetical novel in the Caribbean. But I've kind of had to restrict somewhere. And I guess I've chosen poetry and also, in fact, kind of thought, but poetry because of maybe the kind of condensation in the images. So I said something, I think, at some point about metaphor. And René Merlin wrote about the metaphor is kind of very bound up with ecological thinking just by definition, because metaphor is about connection. And these poems are kind of so dense in metaphor and imagery, and they're so incredibly experimental in terms of kind of sound and sound and associations, ascribing different kind of textures and meanings to different aspects of the environment, if that kind of makes sense. I hope the images that I've quoted give you some of that. But I think there's just this incredible kind of richness to the language that maybe poetry allows. There might be novels that do it too, but I just think there might be something about that sort of experimental form you get with poetry. I'd be interested if people want to also cite novel forms though. And actually, I mean, I've also worked a bit on Glissant with this, but I chose to write about his poetry and his essays. But the novels kind of do it as well. But in the poetry, he allows himself to be, quite challenging to read. So it almost as if you have to allow images to sort of wash over you and kind of suggest, sensations and textures rather than looking for direction or kind of meaning or plot. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is what makes it really interesting to read and keep talking about the agency of poetry, and particularly post-colonial in a post-colonial sense. That also reminds me of Ben Okri's poem on Grenfell Tower, for example. It's not actually relevant to ecology in that sense, but it is. I mean, something that really makes people feel the violence, the destruction, even more than when you read a novel. It's
Yeah.
also, I think, it's something that makes it more, in a sense, worthwhile.
Or
Yeah,
maybe we
that's
could
why.
say there's, yeah, we could say there's some idea of kind of what poetic language can do, and actually sometimes that's working through prose. So I don't want to, as I said, I don't want to be too kind of hierarchical about it between genres,
No.
but it's about a kind of experimental use of language, and poetry maybe kind of gives you space for that. There might be kind of subversive forms of novel writing and prose writing, certainly, and somebody like Glissant that do that too.
And especially if you're really writing in Glissant's sense, when you just say you are just writing in presence of the others, while knowing about the others in
That was
presence
from
of.
Glissant, right?
Yeah,
You're thinking, yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah,
So he's
yeah,
right.
yeah.
I write in the presence of all the languages of the world. Yeah, I
Exactly,
found
exactly.
that line kind of captivating, so I ended up writing about that some years ago. But yeah,
Really, yeah. That's
yeah.
something that also something really keeps resonating with me as well.
Mm,
Interesting, really, but very, very powerful. Well, thank you
mm,
very much. It was beautiful. I mean, the talk and everything, it was really, for me, very, very provocative,
mhm,
something that really kept me thinking. Because I'm not actually myself doing my research in poetry, but rather in novel, and not
mhm,
actually novels in the, present sense. We are very much concerned with life writing. We're very much
mhm,
concerned about talking, or let's say writing about ourselves,
mm,
not in the sense of bildungsroman or anything. So
mhm,
poetry is even, I think, something more significant
mhm,
and difficult to read, but again,
mhm.
it has all the potential to talk to the readers and the listeners. So I was wondering whether there are any questions or any remarks other than my very long one. And I see here Seda's hand.
Hey,
Thank you, Seda.
Jane, thank you for this talk. So during your talk, you have mentioned plural distributed forms of agency, and then when you're talking about it, you specifically refer to the agency of the nature in these novels. And poetry. Again, I keep saying novels
Mhm.
because we're so used to talking
Mhm.
about world literature through novels. But poetry is also a form of performance as well, and it is read. It is there to be read, and most of the time read out, to be read out loud, to be read together, maybe. So I was wondering, in this plural distributed form of agency, how can we carry the conversation to the perspective of the audience in this decolonization process as an act of
Mm.
performance, but also as an act of reading, maybe reading out loud, reading in communities, in groups? Like, would you like, I wonder what you think about that side of it.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting point. I mean, in some ways, poetry of people like Césaire and Glissant it's quite cerebral, but it's also there's a lot of use of sound, so that gonna make sense in a kind of read out orally as well. Um, I mean, I think they probably could be we could be working with oral readings more than we actually do with those kinds of thinkers. But actually, I'm kind of looking into a project. I mean, we're trying to do a grant application, which is probably not going to work, so the success rate is so terrible. But we want to actually try to create a dialogue between some of these thinkers and kind of like gardening activists in London and in the Caribbean. And what we're finding are the underlying principles of what we're looking at are really, really very similar. So we want to kind of look into how far maybe they're interested in hearing about poetry and kind of bring it to life through poetry and music, and then similarly how we can kind of find out more about how actual gardening practices kind of bring this into life as well. But that's not quite answering your question. Something that just occurred to me though also was I've also looked at this in Daniel Maximin, whose poetry is it's more kind of bound up with music, and there's a kind of theorization of the role of music and musicality and oral forms in the way he writes, actually. I think that's definitely that's part of the aesthetic. He talks about it as, marronage, marooning, like the culture of the runaway slave, which is all about this kind of rejection of sovereignty and ownership and kind of property and demarcation. But so marronage is almost like a figure for this way of thinking. And then he kind of enacts that by having different instruments and different voices and singers and all within the poems, if that makes sense. So that maybe that's just another dimension to the oral.
No, it does actually makes a perfect sense. And then you said that it doesn't answer my question, but even the idea that you're just like carrying these poetries and then allowing, like, not necessarily you're allowing them, but they're crossing all those borders to be able to reach to this contemporary era to be read by gardeners in the London actually is an interesting perspective, because usually when we're thinking about audience, we either temporally or spatially have a tendency to situate them somewhere, and London gardeners was not something that would probably come to mind when you
Well,
think
we'll
of
see if
that.
it works, but
Yeah, right. So yeah, it's interesting.
yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Also, I would like to say, everyone, that you guys are everyone more than welcome to share their questions on chat as well. If you guys are in a position that you are not necessarily able to pull up your cameras or your microphones. And then we do actually have Lowell, my colleague from University of Delaware, has a question in the chat, Simla.
Okay, yeah, I've
Oh, I
just
didn't
seen
see
it.
that.
Yeah, thank you. I'd love to hear you say more about Césaire's phrase, especially Suzanne Césaire's phrase, vertiginous walking. Is this a literal translation? What does this imply about elemental movement or dynamism? Is it something unique to the vegetal? Anyway, my ears perked up when I heard that. Guys.
Yeah, I wish I had my copy of the French here, but it's in my office at work, so I don't have it. But yeah, it's I can't remember the exact terms, but yeah, I think it's pretty literal translation. And I think this is an example where, bringing different kinds of image and word and attributes together. So like with the vegetal fire also seems kind of strangely paradoxical, but different parts of the environment are affected by one another. So the vines are kind of, so that there's certainly a celebration of kind of movement. And I think she's thinking here of there's the images connecting the earth with the sky. So there maybe there's a kind of dizziness to this movement. It's so kind of expansive. Yeah, the ethereal poses then. Yeah, I guess I think it's just all about kind of movement. Yeah, and this movement is, it's potentially vertiginous because it's not something that can be kind of, mastered and pinned down and planned in advance. Yeah, so you say, is it unique to the vegetal? I think, I think that so the kind of the vines and the rocks are also kind of working together. So I'd say within the image, the kind of imagery aesthetic of both Aimé and Suzanne Césaire, there's also this kind of movement in geology as well.
I see. I didn't know that. Yeah, there
Mm.
must be something like that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, because there's a lot of stuff about the volcano and the earthquake, and the land
Mm.
itself is kind of dynamic.
Well, yeah, as opposed to this vertical, what do you call, understanding of, yeah, super much to unpack, Mr. Dockett says, yeah. So thank you very much for both the question and for your answers. I see, um, no, I don't see any hands here. Perhaps I could just say this has been very informative and also provocative for me. Thank you very much for your beautiful presentation. And thank you, everyone, for attending and for listening to Professor Hiddleston's talk. And I hope to see you again, everyone, in our next webinar series. Thank you, everyone. And I'd like to say goodbye, everyone.
Thank you so much for coming.
Goodbye. Thanks.